Okay, everyone, the first thing I want to talk about this week is the outline that's due next week. I did post in next week's folder some samples of outlines and a link to a site that I think gives good advice on how to do an outline. Just remember when you're outlining that if there's an A, there has to be a B. If there's a 1, there has to be a 2. It should be fairly detailed. I do want you to outline the intro and the conclusion as well. And, you know, in the end, it's probably going to be a page and a half or something like that. Also this week, you're participating in reading task number 3. And note when you look at that you can reference what's in chapter 14, even though chapter 14 is in next week's reading assignment. And you're talking about a religious order, so make sure you don't write about Muslims. They are not a religious order, they are a religion. Religious order are Christian men and women, and it is a Christian or Catholic thing. And several are mentioned in the chapters, especially chapter 12 and 14, or 13, maybe it's 13 and 14. But some that you might research would be the Benedictines, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, the Cistercians, the Begans. Those were ones that are mentioned in the book, okay? So that is by 11:55 a.m. on Tuesday that should be done. And next week you don't have a reading task or a discussion, you just have the outline due. So, and the week after that is the midterm, and then you have your fall break. So things are going pretty quickly. So a little bit about the reading that you're going to do this week. First of all, the first chapter you're going to read is all about Eastern Christianity. And it's basically talking about the Roman Empire and how it got divided into 2 parts. And even though it was like the Western Empire and the Eastern Empire, different emperors tried to keep those people kind of unified, and others weren't as successful at that. And this led to some kind of beginning issues, and then eventually this led to some real issues between the 2 churches that resulted eventually in what's called the Great Schism. The Great Schism, the word schism means split. And this is the split between the Western Church and the Eastern Church. So the chapter you're going to read helps you try to understand some of the developments in the Eastern Church, because you hear so much about Western Christianity. That's what is mostly practiced here in the U.S. So one person that was kind of important was the Patriarch of Constantinople. There were several patriarchs, but the one in Constantinople was the most important and was seen as the head of the Eastern Church. And for a long time, the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Pope were seen as sort of equals. And then eventually the Pope was seen as above the Patriarch. And of course the people in the West believed that's the way it should be, and the people in the East did not agree with that. So there's conflict that starts to rise between those 2 groups. The big difference was in the East, they saw the emperor as being kind of the head of the church, and in the West they saw the church as having more power than the government. And so the emperor would call the church councils and ultimately was seen as the final decider in the East. And this was called Caesaropapism when the emperor was in charge. Some of the problems that, or some of the kind of issues that were bigger in the East versus the West, one was iconoclasm. And so this was basically the use of icons in religious worship. An icon could be any religious piece of art. It could be a sculpture. It could be a piece of, a painting. And so in the East, they started to see this as a form of idolatry, that they thought people were kind of worshiping the art rather than worshiping God. And in the West, they saw art as a mediator, something that helped us better understand God, that helped us feel God's presence. And in a lot of cases, the art was really important because a lot of people were illiterate, and the art kind of told the stories. Also, they practiced a spiritual practice called hesychasm. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. But basically, this is like a mantra, and, it's kind of centering yourselves and trying to be really still with the Lord. Some other differences were the language of the Mass was different. In the East, they used Greek, and in the West, they used Latin. They also viewed the Pope differently. Of course, I just said that, but in the West, they saw the Pope as the most important human, and in the East, they thought the Pope and the Patriarch should be equal. A big issue, which won't sound so big to you, is what they call the filioque clause. So much was debated in the early church councils about the nature of Jesus. Was he fully human? Was he fully divine? Was he both? Was he neither? Was he somewhere in the middle, somehow like a demigod or something like that? And so when they were writing the creed, and they added in the line that the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father and the Son, the people in the East really disagreed with that. They only think that the Holy Spirit comes from the Father. They don't see the Father and the Son as equal. And so when a pope kind of demanded that everyone include the filioque clause, that led to a lot of problems too. And like I said, eventually there's this great split between the churches in 1054 AD. And all of this is sort of rising conflict to that. Another thing that happened around this time is the rise of Islam. And remember, I just said in the Eastern Church that they didn't think that icons were a good thing. This is something that's also true in Islam. So Islam developed in the 500s with Muhammad, who was a caravan driver from Mecca. And he liked to spend some time in a cave where he could have, total quiet and he could kind of reflect. And there he had a vision of Angel Gabriel, or as they would call him, Angel Jibril. And Jibril kind of gave him this vision and told him to memorize everything that he was told. And so Muhammad left the cave and went and told people what Jibril was telling him. And someone eventually wrote that down into what's today called the Quran. And it is kind of the goal of someone who is Islamic to memorize the Quran, because Muhammad was illiterate and couldn't write anything down. He had it all memorized. So this started a new religion called Islam. Islam means surrender, or the surrenderer. And so people who follow this religion are Muslims. And they have many beliefs. You'll read about the 5 pillars of Islam in your chapter. But essentially what happened is they started to spread, and they really believed that they were supposed to spread this religion. And so they started to do this with force, like in a militaristic way. And in Islam, they have a word called jihad, and this is like a holy war. But basically, jihad was originally translated to be like this call to spread the word. But again, it took on sort of a violent military bent. And so they started moving from the east toward the west and conquering lands and taking over land. And of course, part of the land they took over was the Holy Land. And this made it really difficult because Christians could no longer make an easy pilgrimage. And this was kind of something that was part of what they tried to do. And so there was rising conflict with the Muslims as well. And this culminated with the Crusades, which happened shortly after the schism, about 50 years later. And Pope Urban II was the Pope of the Catholic Church at this point. And in cahoots with the Patriarch of Constantinople, convinced the Catholic Church to enter into the Crusades. And I shouldn't say in cahoots like he had poor intentions. They really did begin with good intentions to take back the Holy Land, which they believed was theirs. The Crusades were ugly wars. There was only one crusade that was even successful for the Christians, and that was the First Crusade. All of the rest of them kind of started good, but kind of ended up resulting in more individual people trying to gain wealth and power, and they would loot churches and steal things, and obviously lots of people were killed too. The Crusades were attempting to stop the spread of Islam, which also was a good thing for Christianity. Of course, we believe that we should spread a Christian truth. So anyway, they were stopped by Charles Martel right before they got to Gaul, which is modern-day France. So that's why you see so much of what was the Eastern Roman Empire being today Islamic, whereas the Western Empire is still mostly Christian. As far as Christianity goes, the monasteries were really building. This was in the middle of the feudal system. So the monastic lands were kind of given to the monasteries, and in return they had a loyalty to the king. These were more like local kings and not like kings of big countries, but the king was the person who was in charge, and the lords and the serfs, they all kind of worked for the king. And so one monastic movement that